What if the person you swore to love for eternity decided your eternity should end today? For Elara Vance, this wasn't a twisted fantasy. It was the moment her life truly began under the searing, indifferent sun of the Mojave Desert. At 29, Elara had learned to measure her life in disappointments. Each sunrise in the small, dusty town of Redemption Creek brought with it the same heavy silence, a silence that had seeped into the very walls of the modest clapboard house she shared with her husband, Julian Croft. From her kitchen window, she would watch the town's women, their bellies round with new life or their arms cradling newborns, walking towards the general store. Each glimpse was a fresh wound in a heart already scarred by 5 years of failed hopes. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of unanswered prayers, 5 years of a monthly, punctual tide of blood that served as a cruel reminder of what society, and her husband, considered her greatest failure as a woman. Julian, at first, had played the part of a patient man. When they married in a simple ceremony at the town's only church, he'd whispered assurances that children would come in their own time. But as the seasons turned and the years stretched on, his patience soared into frustration, then curdled into resentment, and finally, hardened into a quiet, chilling contempt. His once tender words became sharp-edged barbs. His warm embraces grew mechanical and cold. As the prosperous owner of a regional freight company, Julian had carved out a formidable reputation in Redemption Creek. His business, connecting the isolated town to the burgeoning cities, afforded him a position of respect. Yet that very same status made him acutely aware of the whispers and sidelong glances of his peers. Men his age paraded their sons, their future heirs. Julian, on the other hand, had a wife who couldn't give him a legacy. At Sunday gatherings, Elara felt the pitying stares of her sisters-in-law as she approached. Her nieces and nephews would chase each other through the house while she sat in a corner, a fragile smile plastered on her face, her heart shattering into 1,000 tiny pieces. Julian had long ceased to defend her. Now, when someone made a thinly veiled comment about his lack of an heir, he would simply change the subject or walk away, leaving her to bear the humiliation alone. The day that would unravel her world began with a particularly vicious argument. Julian had returned from a meeting with the town's other founding families where, he recounted with brutal detail, the conversation had been about expanding their family dynasties, about the futures they were building for their children. "It's a disgrace, Elara," he'd spat, pacing the living room like a caged panther. "They all ask about my son, and what am I supposed to say? That my wife is defective? That she can't even perform the most basic function of a wife?" The words struck Elara like physical blows, but years of verbal abuse had forged a kind of emotional armor. She remained silent, as she had learned to do, praying for the storm to pass. "Tomorrow, we are going to see Dr. Finch," Julian announced, his voice leaving no room for debate. "I want him to examine you thoroughly and tell me exactly what's wrong with you. I'm tired of the uncertainty." Dr. Finch was Redemption Creek's most respected physician, an older man who had delivered half the town's population. His office was in the center of town, a colonial-style building that had served the community for decades. Elara had avoided this visit, knowing in her gut that the news would not be good, but she no longer had a choice. The consultation was a humiliating ordeal, seared into her memory like a branding iron. Dr. Finch, with his thick spectacles and solemn expression, examined her with a professional detachment that made her feel less like a person and more like a malfunctioning piece of machinery. Julian waited in the adjoining room, his anxious pacing punctuated by the striking of matches as he lit one cigarette after another. After what felt like an eternity of probing questions and invasive procedures, Dr. Finch summoned Julian to deliver the verdict. Elara sat on a hard wooden chair, still trembling from the experience, as she listened to the words that would seal her fate. Julian, Dr. Finch began, his tone grave, after a careful examination of your wife, I can confirm what you may have suspected. He paused, his voice taking on the same somber quality one might use to diagnose a terminal illness. Mrs. Croft has a condition that renders her completely barren. Her reproductive organs are malformed in a way that makes conception impossible. She will never be able to have children. The silence that followed was deafening. Elara felt the world tilt on its axis. Every secret hope, every whispered prayer, every promise she'd made to a silent heaven evaporated in an instant. Officially, she was a broken woman. Incomplete. Useless. Julian absorbed the news with a strange mixture of relief and fury. Relief because he finally had a definitive answer. Fury because that answer confirmed his deepest fears. He didn't say a word on the walk home, but Elara could feel the rage radiating from him like heat from a furnace. That night, Julian didn't come to dinner. He locked himself in his study with a bottle of whiskey, and Elara could hear his muffled curses long into the night. She went to bed alone, as she had on so many other nights, but this time she knew something had irrevocably changed. It wasn't just that their marriage was dead, it was that her value as a human being had been officially declared null and void. The next morning, Julian appeared at breakfast with a disturbingly cheerful demeanor that immediately put Elara on high alert. He had coffee brewed and pastries laid out, something he hadn't done since the first months of their marriage. My dear Elara, he said, with a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes, I've been thinking about us, about our marriage, about everything we've been through. Elara watched him, her suspicion mounting. She knew her husband well enough to recognize that this sudden kindness was a mask for something sinister. I think we need a change of scenery, Julian continued, spreading butter on a croissant. A proper journey. Like the ones we used to take when we were courting. I thought we could go out into the desert, camp under the stars, remember why we fell in love. The suggestion was so jarring, so out of place, that Elara was momentarily speechless. Julian hadn't shown the slightest romantic interest in her for years. And now, the day after receiving confirmation of her infertility, he wanted a romantic trip. I don't know, Julian, she managed to say, her mind racing. It seems like a strange time. It's the perfect time, he interrupted, his tone sharp and final. We need this time away to decide what we are going to do with our future. No distractions, no town gossips interfering in our business. There was an undercurrent in his voice that sent a chill down her spine, but she had no alternative. As his wife, her duty was to obey, especially now that she had failed in her primary role. 2 days later, they set off into the Mojave Desert in Julian's sturdy wagon. It was a journey of several hours, heading towards a desolate, arid region he knew from his freight routes. The Mojave stretched out before them, an endless expanse of cracked earth and shimmering heat under the merciless afternoon sun. Towering saguaros and thorny creosote bushes dotted the landscape, while waves of heat distorted the distant horizon. There was no sign of human life for miles in any direction, only the profound, ringing silence that belongs to the world's most remote places. Julian pulled the wagon to a halt in a clearing surrounded by rust-red rock formations, sculpted by centuries of wind and erosion into otherworldly shapes. The place had a stark, severe beauty, but also a sense of profound isolation that made Elara feel small and insignificant. "This spot is perfect," Julian announced as he climbed down from the wagon. "No one will bother us out here." He helped Elara down and began to unload a few supplies, but she noticed there was far less than what she had packed. When she questioned him, he brushed it off, saying he'd left the rest in town so they wouldn't be weighed down. While Julian made a show of setting up a rudimentary camp, Elara wandered a short distance away to take in the surroundings. The sheer vastness of the desert was overwhelming. Yet there was also something liberating about being so far from the judging eyes and hurtful comments of her town. For the first time in years, she could breathe without feeling the weight of expectation. When she returned to the clearing, she found Julian standing by the wagon with an expression she had never seen before. His eyes held a glacial coldness that made her step back instinctively. "Elara," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "We've reached the end of our journey together." "What do you mean?" she asked, though a cold dread was already beginning to dawn in her mind, a horrifying understanding of the truth. "A woman who cannot provide an heir is not a wife," Julian declared, with the same detached tone one might use to comment on the weather. "She is a burden. I cannot continue to carry the shame of being married to you. It's better to end things here, where no one will ever find you." The words hit Elara like a physical shock. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was hearing. The man with whom she had shared 5 years of her life, the man she had once loved and served faithfully, was announcing his intention to murder her, simply because she could not bear children. "Julian, please," she managed to whisper, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I'm your wife. You promised to love me through everything." "Those promises were made to a whole woman," he replied, showing not a flicker of emotion. "You are nothing more than an empty shell, a mistake of nature. I will not carry that burden for the rest of my life." Without another word, Julian climbed back into the wagon and whipped the horses into motion. Elara ran after him, screaming his name, begging him not to leave her, but he never once looked back. Within minutes, the wagon disappeared behind the rock formations, taking with it every scrap of security and stability Elara had ever known. She was left utterly alone in the middle of the desert, with no water, no food, no shelter, and only the clothes on her back. The midday sun beat down on her like molten lead, and the immense silence of the desert wrapped around her like a funeral shroud. For the very first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be completely and utterly abandoned. The first hours were a blur of pure shock. Elara stood frozen in the same spot where the wagon had vanished, half expecting Julian to return, for it all to be a cruel joke, a twisted lesson to make her appreciate their marriage. But the hours crawled by, and the reality of her situation settled in like sand in her lungs. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and deep crimson, Elara finally moved. Her legs trembled, whether from shock or the onset of dehydration she didn't know, but she managed to stumble towards a rock formation that offered a sliver of shade. The desert night arrived with startling speed, and with it came a cold that was a brutal contrast to the day's oppressive heat. Elara huddled between the rocks, wrapping her arms around herself as the nocturnal sounds of the desert began to stir. The howl of a distant coyote, the whisper of wind through the cactus spines, the rustle of small creatures moving through the scrub. It was then that the true, gut-wrenching despair began to take hold. She had no idea where she was. She had no way of finding her way back to civilization. She had no water or food. Julian had meticulously planned her death, delivering her to a place where no one would ever think to look. As the stars emerged one by one in the clear desert sky, Elara cried all the tears she had held back during years of a loveless marriage. She cried for her shattered dreams of motherhood, for her lost innocence in trusting a man who saw her as a disposable object, for her absolute loneliness in a world that had no place for women like her. But sometime during that long, endless night, as she battled the cold and the terror, something shifted inside Elara. A spark of fury began to glow in her chest, a steely resolve she had never known she possessed. She would not die in this desert. She would not give Julian the satisfaction of her quiet disappearance. If fate had brought her to this desolate place, then it was here she would discover who Elara Vance truly was when everything she had ever known was stripped away. Wherever you are watching this story from, dear viewer, we would love to read your comments on how you think our protagonist will find the strength to survive this devastating betrayal. The second day in the desert began its brutal assault on Elara's body. Her lips were cracked and dry like the bark of a dead tree. Her tongue felt swollen inside her mouth, and every breath was a searing pain in her throat. The midday sun beat down without mercy, turning the rocks into ovens that radiated heat like glowing embers. She had tried to walk at dawn, when the air still held a trace of the night's coolness, but she soon realized that aimless wandering would only lead her deeper into the unforgiving wilderness. Her cotton dress, chosen so carefully for what she believed would be a romantic trip, was now torn by thorns and stained with blood from the small cuts that covered her arms and legs. The hallucinations began around noon. At first, they were just shifting shadows in her peripheral vision, shapes that would vanish when she tried to focus on them directly. Then, she started to hear familiar voices calling her from a distance. The voice of her mother, who had been dead for a decade, urging her to come home. The voice of her younger sister, telling her everything would be all right, she just had to walk a little further. By the time the sun reached its zenith, Elara could no longer distinguish between reality and the phantoms her desperate mind was creating to survive. She had dragged herself into the meager shade of a Palo Verde tree, where she lay in a semi-conscious state, her body racked by occasional spasms from severe dehydration. It was in that moment of agony that the figure appeared who would change the course of her destiny forever. Stonehawk had been tracking a mountain lion since sunrise, when he noticed the strange prints in the sand. They weren't the barefoot, silent steps of his own people, but the deep, clumsy impressions of a white person's shoes. What caught his attention wasn't just the presence of a stranger in the territory of the Serpent River people, but the erratic pattern of the tracks, which spoke of someone lost and desperate. As an experienced warrior and scout, Stonehawk knew that a lost white person in the desert usually meant trouble. They could be prospectors looking to stake a claim, surveyors for the army, or merchants who had underestimated the vastness and danger of his people's land. His first instinct was to turn back and report the finding to the tribal elders, but something in the shape of the footprints gave him pause. There was a desperation etched into those tracks, the kind that came from someone who had been left behind, rather than someone who had simply lost their way. Furthermore, the tracks were clearly from a single person, not a group, and they seemed smaller than those of a full-grown man. He followed the trail with the patience and skill honed over a lifetime of hunting. The tracks led him through rock fields and around giant saguaros, always keeping to the shadows to avoid being spotted by a potential ambush. But when he finally found the source of the footprints, what he saw left him completely unprepared. Under the minimal shade of a Palo Verde tree lay a white woman. Her brown hair was a tangled mess of thorns and sand. Her skin, normally pale, was red and swollen from the desert sun. Her breathing was so shallow that for a moment Stonehawk thought she was already gone, but as he drew closer, he could see the faint movement of her chest and hear the unconscious moans escaping her cracked lips. Stonehawk's first reaction was one of deep suspicion. The white people had brought nothing but death and destruction to his people. They had slain his kinsmen, stolen their lands, and poisoned their rivers with their mining operations. Seeing a white woman dying in his people's territory stirred a complex mixture of grim satisfaction and disgust at his own reaction. But there was something about the woman's condition that didn't fit with his previous experiences with the settlers. She didn't have the expensive, elaborate clothing of the army officers' wives, nor the soft, manicured hands of someone who had never worked a day in her life. Her dress, though it had once been nice, was simple and modest. More importantly, she was utterly alone, without weapons, without provisions, without even a canteen of water. Stonehawk stood watching her for several long minutes, fighting an internal battle between his culturally programmed mistrust of all white people and his innate compassion for any human being in mortal danger. His elders had taught him stories of the settlers' cruelty, but they had also taught him about courage, the sacredness of life, and the duty to show mercy to the helpless. In the end, compassion won. He could not simply walk away and leave a human being to die, regardless of their skin color or their origin. But he couldn't take her directly to the main camp without causing a major incident. He would have to care for her in secret until she was strong enough to be sent back to her own world. He approached Elara cautiously, keeping one hand on the hilt of his knife in case this was some elaborate trap. But when he was finally beside her, he could see there could be no deception in her condition. She was truly on the verge of death. Stonehawk took out his water skin and carefully lifted Elara's head, trickling small drops between her parched lips. At first, she didn't react, but then she began to swallow instinctively. Her eyes fluttered open for a brief, glassy, disoriented moment before closing again. The process of stabilizing her enough to be moved took hours. Stonehawk had to be incredibly careful not to give her too much water too quickly, knowing it could kill her. Slowly, drop by drop, he managed to rehydrate her enough for her to regain a sliver of consciousness. When Elara finally opened her eyes, and they stayed open, the first thing she saw was the face of a native man leaning over her. His skin was weathered and tanned from years in the desert sun. His features were strong and angular, and his dark eyes watched her with a mixture of caution and genuine concern. His long black hair was tied back, and he was dressed in buckskin clothing adorned with beads and symbols she didn't recognize. Elara's initial fear was primal and immediate. Everything she had ever heard about the savages on the frontier rushed into her mind, stories of raids, kidnappings, and brutality. She tried to scramble away from him, but her body was too weak to move more than a few inches. Stonehawk saw the fear in her eyes and understood her reaction perfectly. He raised a hand slowly, palm up, in a universal gesture of peace. "No harm," he said, in a basic, accented English he had learned from traders and missionaries. "Water. Help?" Elara stared at him, wide-eyed, trying to process the situation. This man had given her water. That much was clear from the wetness in her mouth and the slightly less desperate feeling in her throat. But all the stories she'd been told would with this simple act of kindness, keeping her paralyzed with fear. Stonehawk continued to give her water in small sips, keeping his movements slow and predictable. He had decided the best strategy was to demonstrate his peaceful intentions through consistent actions, rather than with words she might not understand anyway. Over the next few hours, they established a strange, cautious routine. Stonehawk would offer her water and small pieces of dried meat from his hunting pouch, while Elara watched him with the wary scrutiny of a wild animal, ready to bolt. Neither of them spoke much. He, because his English was limited, and she, because she was too frightened and weak to form coherent sentences. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, Stonehawk knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't leave her for another night in the open desert, but he also couldn't take her to the main camp without causing an uproar that could end in death for them both. The solution he settled on was a compromise. There was a small, hidden cave not far from there, one he sometimes used as a base camp when hunting far from his village. He could take her there and nurse her back to health until she was strong enough to survive on her own. Communicating this plan to Elara was a challenge. Stonehawk had to use a combination of broken English, hand gestures, and drawings in the sand to make her understand he wanted to move her to a safer place. Her initial reaction was again one of panic. Being trapped in a cave with him seemed even worse than dying in the open desert. But as the temperature began to plummet with the setting sun and Elara remembered the brutal chill of the previous night, she realized she had few options. She could trust this stranger who, so far, had only helped her, or she could die alone in the desert as Julian had planned. Stonehawk lifted her into his arms, surprised at how light she was. The journey to the cave was slow and difficult, as he had to navigate the rocky terrain while carrying a semi-conscious woman. But finally, they reached the shelter, carved by nature into the side of a large rock formation. The cave was small but dry, and Stonehawk had stashed some supplies there on previous hunts. There were fur blankets, more dried food, and most importantly, a small natural spring that provided clean, fresh water. The next few days were a carefully choreographed routine of survival and mutual suspicion. Stonehawk hunted during the cool hours of the early morning and late afternoon, bringing back rabbits, lizards, and the occasional small bird, which he cooked over a small, smokeless fire he kept hidden at the back of the cave. Elara gradually recovered, gaining strength each day, but she remained constantly on guard, ready to flee if necessary. Their communication slowly evolved from crude gestures to a blend of English and the few words of his language that Stonehawk taught her for basics like water, food, and thank you. Elara discovered she had a natural aptitude for language, something she'd never had a chance to explore in her restricted life as a merchant's wife. It was on the fifth night in the cave that the first true moment of human connection occurred between them. Elara had a violent nightmare about Julian, reliving the moment of her abandonment, and woke up screaming. Stonehawk, who had been sleeping near the cave entrance to guard against any outside threats, was instantly awake and at her side. Instead of recoiling in fear as she had in the previous days, Elara found herself seeking comfort in his presence. She began to sob uncontrollably, releasing all the pent-up emotion from years of marital abuse and the fresh trauma of being left for dead. Stonehawk didn't understand the English words she was crying, but he recognized the universal sound of profound human pain. Without saying anything, he sat down beside her and began to speak in a low, soothing voice in his native tongue, telling her an old story his grandmother had told him as a child, about a woman who lost everything but found a new life among the stars. Though Elara didn't understand the words, there was something deeply comforting in the cadence of his voice and the rhythm of his language. For the first time since her abandonment, she felt genuinely safe. Not the false, conditional security she had known in her marriage, but something deeper and more authentic. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. The mutual suspicion began to transform into something more complex: respect, curiosity, and the first glimmer of an attraction that neither of them had anticipated. Over the following days, they began to communicate beyond the basic needs of survival. Stonehawk taught her more of his language, while Elara helped him improve his English. They discovered they both possessed a natural curiosity about the other's world, one that went beyond the stereotypes and prejudices they had learned from their respective cultures. Elara learned that Stonehawk was not the bloodthirsty savage depicted in the frontier stories. He was an intelligent and thoughtful man with a profound knowledge of the desert and a code of honor that rivaled that of any gentleman she had ever known. He had lost his wife and infant son in a raid by U.S. soldiers 3 years prior and had lived a mostly solitary life since, dedicating himself to hunting and protecting the sacred lands of his people. For his part, Stonehawk discovered that Elara was not the fragile, spoiled woman he had expected to find. There was an inner strength in her that became more evident with each passing day, a resilience that had been forged in years of silent suffering. He also noticed her sharp intellect and her ability to adapt, qualities that were deeply respected in his culture. The moment that changed everything came on their 10th night together. Stonehawk had returned from a particularly successful hunt with a small deer, enough meat to last them for many days. As they prepared the meal together, an activity that had become natural and comfortable for them both, Elara realized that for the first time in years, she felt truly valued as a person. Not for her ability to bear children, not for her appearance, not for her utility as a wife. Stonehawk respected her for her strength, her intelligence, and her willingness to learn. He treated her as an equal, something she had never before experienced. That night, as they shared the roasted venison and watched the stars from the mouth of the cave, Elara made a decision she knew would alter the course of her life forever. She did not want to go back to her old world. She no longer wanted to be the broken, disposable woman Julian had left in the desert. Stonehawk, she said, using the name he had taught her in his own language, I want to stay with you. He looked at her in surprise, understanding not just the words, but the immense weight of what she was saying. A white woman choosing to live among his people meant forsaking everything she had ever known and embracing a life that would be seen as worse than death by her own kind. "You are sure?" he asked in English, his voice filled with gravity. "Your people will never take you back if you choose this. My people may never accept you." Elara looked him directly in the eyes, and in hers, he saw a steely determination that hadn't been there when he'd found her dying in the desert. "My people already threw me away," she replied, her voice clear and firm. "But here with you, for the first time in my life, I feel truly alive." Elara's decision marked the beginning of a transformation neither of them could have foreseen. During the following weeks in the cave, their relationship evolved from a cautious alliance to something much deeper. The days were filled with mutual teachings that went far beyond mere language exchange. Stonehawk taught her the secrets of the desert that his people had preserved for generations. He showed her how to identify edible plants amidst the seemingly hostile vegetation, how to find water by following the subtle clues left by animals, and how to read the signs of the weather in the cloud formations and the behavior of birds. Elara absorbed every lesson with an eagerness that surprised them both, discovering abilities she never knew she possessed. In the afternoons, when the heat of the day became too intense to bear, they practiced the art of tanning hides and crafting basic tools. Elara's hands, which had only known the limited domestic chores of a merchant's wife, learned to work leather until it was soft and pliable, to carve wood into useful utensils, and to weave plant fibers into strong cordage. But it was the nights that truly cemented their emotional bond. Sitting by the small fire at the back of the cave, they shared stories of their past lives. Stonehawk told her of his childhood in his tribe's village, of the lessons learned from his father and uncles, of the joys and sorrows of being a warrior in difficult times. His stories were imbued with a philosophy of life that saw the interconnectedness of all living things, a perspective that resonated deep within Elara's wounded soul. In turn, she told him of her life in Redemption Creek, but not of the failed marriage and constant humiliation. Instead, she shared memories of her childhood, of her mother who had taught her to read and write when few women had that opportunity, of her secret fascination with the stars, and of her repressed desire to explore a world beyond the narrow expectations society had for a woman in her position. One night, while they were watching a meteor shower light up the desert sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet, something shifted between them. Stonehawk was telling her a legend of his people, about how the shooting stars were the spirits of great warriors finding peace after their struggles, when Elara realized she was no longer listening to the words, but was lost in the sound of his voice and the intensity in his eyes. When he noticed the different way she was looking at him, he trailed off mid-sentence. The silence that followed was not awkward, but filled with an electricity they could both feel. Slowly, almost without conscious thought, they moved closer until their faces were only inches apart. The first kiss was hesitant, almost tentative, as if they both knew they were crossing a threshold that would change everything forever. But as their lips met, all the cultural barriers, all the learned prejudices, all the supposed differences that separated them, dissolved like smoke in the desert wind. What followed was a mutual exploration, not just of their bodies, but of their souls. For the first time in her life, Elara experienced what it meant to be desired for who she truly was, not for what she was expected to be. Stonehawk touched her with a reverence she had never known, as if she were something precious and sacred, rather than an object of marital duty. For Stonehawk, making love to Elara was an equally profound revelation. Since the death of his first wife, he had thought he would never again feel such an intimate connection with another person. But Elara had awakened in him not just physical desire, but a tenderness he had buried along with his grief. Her pale skin under the desert moonlight seemed beautiful to him in a completely new way, and her response to his touch revealed a passion that had lain dormant through years of a loveless marriage. The following weeks were a period of intense, secret happiness. By day, they perfected the survival skills they would need to live together, and by night, they explored the depths of their emotional and physical connection. Elara blossomed in ways she could never have imagined. Her body became stronger and more agile, her mind sharper and more observant, and her spirit freer than it had ever been. But they both knew they couldn't live in isolation forever. Stonehawk had responsibilities to his tribe, and sooner or later, they would have to confront the reality of what their union would mean in the wider context of both their cultures. The decision to introduce Elara to his people came when the cave's resources began to dwindle, and it became clear they would need the support of the tribe to survive in the long term. Stonehawk knew it would be a difficult and potentially dangerous process, but he also knew he couldn't keep Elara hidden forever. The preparation for this presentation was meticulous. Stonehawk taught Elara the basic customs of Apache courtesy, how to show respect to the elders, how to conduct herself in the presence of the tribal council, and most importantly, how to demonstrate that her presence would be a benefit rather than a burden to the community. When the day finally came, Elara was so nervous she could barely eat. She was dressed in the buckskin clothing Stonehawk had helped her make, her hair was braided in the style he had taught her, and she had practiced the greeting words in his language until she could pronounce them perfectly. But none of it could quell the fear she felt at the prospect of being judged by a group of people who had every reason in the world to hate someone like her. The Serpent River camp was nestled in a protected valley, where natural rock formations provided both defense and access to fresh water. When Stonehawk and Elara appeared on the path leading to the camp, they immediately drew the attention of the lookouts who had been tracking their approach for miles. The initial reaction was exactly what Elara had feared. Men, women, and children gathered to stare at the white woman who had arrived with one of their most respected warriors. The expressions on their faces ranged from curiosity to open hostility, and Elara could hear whispers in a language she barely understood that were clearly not complimentary. Stonehawk had prepared his presentation to the Council of Elders carefully. He explained the circumstances in which he had found Elara, emphasizing her abandonment and the fact that she had been cast out by her own people. He spoke of her learned skills, her respect for their customs, and her willingness to contribute to the well-being of the tribe. But what truly shifted the council's attitude was when Stonehawk publicly declared his intention to take her as his wife according to their traditions. This transformed the situation from the mere presence of a foreigner into a matter of family and honor that required serious consideration. The tribe's most revered elder, a woman named Willow Creek who had seen more than 80 winters and had witnessed all the changes the white man had brought to her world, asked to speak with Elara directly. With Stonehawk acting as translator, the old woman asked probing questions about Elara's motivations, her expectations, and her understanding of what it meant to live as one of the people. Elara's answers were honest to the point of vulnerability. She admitted she didn't fully comprehend all the implications of her decision, but explained that for the first time in her life, she felt valued as a complete human being. She spoke of her willingness to learn, to work, and to contribute to the tribe in whatever way they saw fit. What impressed Willow Creek most were not Elara's words, but the way Stonehawk looked at her as she spoke. In his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen since before the death of his first wife: true happiness and inner peace. As a wise elder, she understood that the happiness of key individuals in the tribe affected the well-being of the entire community. After hours of deliberation, the council came to a conditional decision. Elara would be accepted into the tribe for a trial period, during which she would have to prove her ability to adapt and contribute. If, at the end of that period, both she and the tribe were satisfied with the arrangement, a formal adoption ceremony would be held, followed by her marriage to Stonehawk. The next few months were the most challenging, but also the most rewarding of Elara's life. She lived in the lodge of a family who agreed to teach her the specific domestic skills of their culture, while during the day she worked alongside the other women of the tribe on communal tasks. She learned to process buffalo and deer hides in ways that used every part of the animal, to create medicines from desert plants, to weave watertight baskets from natural fibers, and to participate in the spiritual ceremonies that marked the cycles of tribal life. Every day brought new challenges, but also new revelations about her own capabilities. The tribe's gradual acceptance became apparent in small but meaningful ways. First, the women stopped whispering when she approached. Then, they began to include her in their casual conversations. Eventually, some of the younger women began to actively seek her company, curious about her former life and impressed by her eagerness to learn new things. The children were the first to accept her completely. Her different hair and pale skin fascinated them, and her endless patience with their questions and games quickly won them over. Soon she became a popular figure among the children, who would follow her around the camp asking for stories about the white man's world. It was during this period of adaptation that Elara began to notice changes in her own body. At first, she attributed it to the stress of learning a new way of life. She felt more tired than usual, experienced occasional morning sickness, and noticed a new tenderness in her breasts. She initially dismissed these symptoms as the effects of the radical change in her diet and lifestyle. But when the nausea became more frequent and her monthly cycle was significantly late, a possibility she had believed impossible began to take shape in her mind. The idea was so improbable, so contrary to everything the doctors had told her, that at first she refused to consider it seriously. It was Willow Creek who finally confirmed what Elara had begun to suspect but hadn't dared to believe. The old woman, with her decades of experience assisting with births and caring for pregnant women, immediately recognized the signs. "You are making new life," Willow Creek told her, through Stonehawk, who had been summoned to translate this momentous conversation. "Your body speaks clearly to those who know how to listen." The revelation hit Elara like a lightning bolt. For years, she had lived with the shame and pain of being considered barren. She had endured the constant humiliation of her inability to conceive. She had been abandoned in the desert specifically because she was believed to be a defective woman. And now, in the most unlikely of places, and with the most unlikely of men, she was pregnant. The emotions that surged through her were so intense they left her speechless for several minutes. Joy, disbelief, relief, and a deep, satisfying vindication all mixed into an emotional storm that made her weep with happiness for the first time in years. She wasn't broken after all. Her body wasn't defective. The problem had been her previous marriage, not her. When Stonehawk fully grasped what Willow Creek was saying, his own reaction was just as intense. His first wife had died giving birth to their son, and though he had loved them both deeply, he had always carried the burden of not being able to protect them. The possibility of having another chance at fatherhood awakened in him a mixture of joy and fear. But the greatest surprise was yet to come. During a more detailed examination Willow Creek performed in the following weeks, the old woman discovered something that made her wise eyes widen with astonishment and reverence. "Two hearts beat inside you," she announced, her voice full of awe. "The spirits have blessed you with twins." The news that Elara was carrying twins spread through the camp like wildfire. In their culture, twins were considered a special blessing from the spirits, bearers of unique powers and divine protection. The fact that a white woman who had been adopted into the tribe was now carrying twins was interpreted by many as a powerful sign that her presence was sanctioned by higher forces. The preparations for the birth began immediately. Willow Creek took Elara under her personal care, teaching her not only about the physical aspects of pregnancy and childbirth, but about the spiritual significance of carrying twins. She explained the rituals that would be performed when the babies were born, the protective ceremonies that would ensure their health and strength, and the special responsibilities she would have as the mother of these fortunate children. Stonehawk, for his part, threw himself into the practical preparations. He built a special, larger lodge for his new family, hunted for extra furs to create clothing and blankets for the newborns, and began carving the toys and protective amulets that would be needed for their welcoming ceremonies. The transformation in Elara's status within the tribe was radical. She was no longer just a white woman on trial, but the future mother of Apache twins, a position that carried automatic respect and special protection. The women of the tribe, who had previously been cautious, now vowed to teach her the traditions associated with motherhood and childcare. During the months of her pregnancy, Elara experienced a happiness she had never believed possible. Her body, which had been a source of shame and frustration for so long, was now a source of pride and admiration. The Apache women would touch her growing belly with reverence, whispering about the good fortune the twins would bring not just to their family, but to the entire tribe. Stonehawk became the most attentive husband Elara could have imagined. He protected her without smothering her, cared for her without treating her as if she were weak, and spoke to her belly every night, telling his unborn daughters about the world they were about to enter and the adventures that awaited them. When the time for the delivery finally came, the entire tribe gathered to offer prayers. Willow Creek led the process with the authority of her long experience, assisted by the other elder women. The labor was long and difficult, but Elara met each wave of pain with a steely determination, fueled by the certainty that she was about to receive the greatest gift life could offer. The twins were born just minutes apart. Two perfect, healthy girls, whose first cries echoed in the dawn air like a promise of hope and renewal. Stonehawk held his daughters for the first time with tears streaming down his face, while Elara watched them with a mixture of exhaustion and a profound bliss that filled her completely. In that moment, holding her newborn children in the heart of Apache territory, surrounded by women who had accepted her as a sister, and with the man she loved by her side, Elara knew with absolute certainty that every single moment of suffering in her previous life had been worth it to reach this perfect moment of triumph and rebirth. Several years had passed since the birth of the twins, when Elara's past returned to haunt the peace she had built in the heart of the Serpent River territory. Her daughters, Sky and Tur, names given to them by the tribe in a beautiful welcoming ceremony, had grown strong and healthy under the loving watch of the entire community. By the age of 4, they were running through the camp with the natural agility of Apache children, speaking a charming mixture of English and their father's tongue that made all the adults smile. Elara had fully blossomed in her new life. Her skin, once pale and delicate, was now tanned by the desert sun and weathered by constant work. Her hands, once soft and manicured, now showed the honorable signs of hard labor, calluses from weaving baskets, small scars from processing hides, and a strength that came from years of a physically demanding life. But more than the physical changes, it was her spirit that had undergone the most radical transformation. The timid, broken woman Stone Hawk had found dying in the desert was gone, replaced by someone entirely different. Elara now possessed a quiet confidence that radiated from the very core of her being. She spoke the Serpent River language fluently, participated actively in the decisions of the Women's Council, and had developed a reputation as a skilled healer who combined traditional knowledge with techniques she had adapted from her previous life. Her marriage to Stone Hawk had been formalized in a beautiful ceremony that honored both Apache traditions and the unique journey that had brought them together. They lived in a harmony that amazed all who knew them, to people from completely different worlds who had found in each other not just love, but a perfect complement. But happiness has a way of making people lower their guard, and it was precisely during one of the most peaceful and blissful periods of their new life that danger approached the camp. The news came first through the scouts who patrolled the boundaries of the tribal territory. A group of white men had been asking questions in the frontier towns, showing a crude sketch and offering a substantial reward for information about a missing woman. The description matched Elara's dangerously well. And though years had passed and she had changed so much, the Apache scouts were wise enough to recognize the potential threat. When this information reached the tribal council, the response was immediate and protective. Elara was no longer seen as an outsider, but as a daughter of the tribe, and her twins were considered sacred treasures whose safety was an absolute priority. Stone Hawk volunteered to lead a scouting party that would determine the exact nature of the threat and, if necessary, neutralize it before it could get any closer to the camp. But Elara, when she learned of the situation, made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of hiding or fleeing deeper into Apache territory, she insisted on accompanying the reconnaissance party. Her argument was simple but compelling. If it was truly Julian searching for her, she was the only one who could definitively identify her pursuers and understand their true intentions. After much debate, the council agreed that Elara could accompany the expedition, but only under the strictest security conditions. The twins would remain in the camp under the protection of Willow Creek and the other elder women, while Elara would travel with an escort of the tribe's most experienced warriors. The journey to the borderlands of Mexican-American civilization was a difficult, 3-day ride for Elara. It felt like traveling backward in time, moving away from the life she loved and toward a world she had learned to despise. Every mile that brought them closer to the white settlements made her anxiety grow, not for her own safety, but for what it might mean for the family she had left behind. When they finally reached the outskirts of Redemption Creek, the town where she had lived her former life, Elara felt as though she were looking at the landscape of a half-remembered nightmare. The dusty streets, the adobe houses with their small, dark windows, the church whose bell tower had once marked the monotonous days of her failed marriage. It all seemed strangely small and insignificant compared to the vastness and freedom of the Serpent River territory. They made a hidden camp in the hills surrounding the town, from which they could observe the comings and goings without being detected. They didn't have to wait long to confirm their worst suspicions. On the second day of their surveillance, Elara saw a figure she recognized instantly, despite the years that had passed. Julian Croft, her former husband, the man who had abandoned her to die in the desert. But this was not the same Julian she had known. This man looked prosperous, dressed in fine, expensive clothes, and moved with the arrogance of someone who had acquired considerable wealth. He was accompanied by several men, who were clearly hired gunshot-faced men with well-kept weapons and the vigilant posture of those accustomed to violence. Observing their movements over several days revealed a pattern that made Elara's stomach turn with disgust and fury. Julian was systematically visiting every family, every home, every business in town, showing the sketch and offering an ever-increasing sum for information about the whereabouts of his beloved, missing wife. But what enraged her even more was hearing, from sources in the town who were sympathetic to the Apaches, the story that Julian was telling. According to his version, Elara had tragically disappeared during a romantic trip, likely abducted by bandits or savage Indians. He presented himself as the devoted husband who had spent a fortune searching for her for years, moved by a love that knew no bounds. The truth, of course, was far more sinister. The real reason behind his sudden, desperate search was revealed when the Apache scouts managed to intercept a conversation between Julian and his lawyer. Elara's father, whom she hadn't seen for years due to the restrictions Julian had placed on her social life, had recently passed away, leaving behind a massive land inheritance. According to the law, that inheritance could not be claimed by Julian unless he could either prove Elara was legally dead or have her sign the transfer documents. The blatant hypocrisy and greed of the situation filled Elara with a cold, calculating anger. The very same man who had discarded her as useless was now searching for her desperately, not out of love or remorse, but for money. The warriors wanted to act immediately, to eliminate Julian and his men before they could get any closer to tribal lands. But Elara asked for time to consider all the options. She had learned during her years with the tribe that decisions made in the heat of anger rarely yielded the best results. For 3 days, Elara wrestled with a decision she knew would change everything. She could simply vanish deeper into Apache territory, moving her family to regions so remote they would never be found. She could allow the warriors to quietly eliminate the threat. Or she could confront Julian directly and settle this matter once and for all. The final decision came to her during a night of meditation under the desert stars. She realized that to run or hide would mean living forever in fear, always looking over her shoulder, always wondering when the past would return to claim her. Her daughters deserved to grow up free from that shadow. But more importantly, Elara realized she had changed too much to be intimidated by a man like Julian. The frightened, dependent woman he had known no longer existed. In her place was a woman who had faced death in the desert and emerged stronger. A woman who had learned to value herself, regardless of the opinions of others. A woman who had a family and a community that supported her unconditionally. The plan she developed was both bold and direct. She would appear before Julian in the open, but not as the begging, broken woman he expected to find. She would go as the Apache woman she had become, accompanied by her husband and protected by warriors who would view any threat against her as a declaration of war. The confrontation was staged with meticulous care. Stonehawk and his warriors positioned themselves strategically around the meeting point, invisible but ready to act at the first sign of treachery. Elara dressed in the finest Apache attire she owned. A deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork and embroidery, moccasins she had made with her own hands, and silver jewelry she had received as a wedding gift. Her hair was braided in the traditional style, interwoven with feathers and beads that indicated her status as a warrior's wife and the mother of fortunate twins. When she approached the place where Julian had established his temporary camp on the outskirts of town, his reaction was exactly what she had anticipated. First, complete disbelief at seeing the woman he had left for dead years ago. Then, shock at realizing how much she had changed. Finally, a transparent relief at confirming she was alive and could therefore sign the documents that would grant him access to the inheritance. "Elara, my beloved wife," Julian said, approaching her with his arms outstretched as if expecting an emotional embrace. "I've searched everywhere for you. When you vanished on our trip, I thought you were lost forever." Elara's reply was delivered in perfectly clear English, but with a coldness that cut like a knife. "I didn't vanish, Julian. I was abandoned by you to die in the desert." The direct accusation clearly took him by surprise. His eyes darted nervously toward his hired guns, calculating his options. "I don't know what you are talking about," he answered, trying to maintain the facade of the devoted husband. "You were lost in a sandstone. I searched for days before I had to turn back for help." "Lies," Elara stated, her voice echoing with a newfound authority. "You told me exactly why you were leaving me. Because I was barren. Because a woman who cannot bear children is not worth keeping." At that moment, as if choreographed by the spirits themselves, two small figures emerged from behind the rocks where they had been hidden. The twins, who had secretly insisted on accompanying their mother, ran towards Elara with their arms outstretched, shouting "Ina!" "Mother," in Apache. The look of utter shock on Julian's face was his final undoing. Here was living, breathing proof that all his assumptions about Elara's infertility were wrong. Here were two beautiful, clearly healthy girls, who declared without a shadow of a doubt that the woman he had discarded for being defective was, in fact, perfectly capable of having children. "These are your daughters," he stammered, his brain struggling to process the implications. "These are my daughters," Elara confirmed with fierce pride, gathering the twins into her arms. "The daughters I could never have with you, but that I had with a man who values me for who I am." On cue, Stonehawk emerged from his hidden position, moving with the silent grace of an experienced warrior. His presence instantly shifted the dynamic of the confrontation. He was not just another Indian, he was clearly a leader, a man whose authority and power radiated a quiet but very real threat. "This is my husband," Elara declared, first in her adopted tongue to formally present Stonehawk, before switching back to English. "The father of my daughters. The man who saved me from the death you sentenced me to." The realization that Elara had not only survived, but had thrived, that she had found love and a family, that she had the very children she was supposedly incapable of having, hit Julian like a series of physical blows. But it was the transformation in the woman herself that was most unsettling. This was not the submissive, broken wife he remembered. This was a woman who spoke with authority, who stood with a confidence that made it clear she was not afraid of him, nor did she need anything from him. "Elara, listen," he said, trying to regain control. "I know there have been misunderstandings, but you are my legal wife. Your father has died and left a considerable inheritance. As your husband, I have a right." "You have a right to nothing," Elara interrupted, her voice like a razor's edge. "You forfeited all rights when you left me to die. Under the law, both Mexican and Apache, a husband who abandons his wife in a way that endangers her life automatically renounces all marital rights." The mention of Apache law made Julian's hired guns shift uneasily. "Furthermore," Elara continued relentlessly, "there's the small matter of attempted murder. I have witnesses who heard your confession of intentional abandonment. I have medical proof that the claims of my infertility were false. And I have the protection of an entire Apache tribe that considers your attempt on my life a personal declaration of war." At that moment, as if summoned by her words, the other Apache warriors emerged from their hidden positions, encircling the camp. They made no threatening moves, but their silent presence was more eloquent than any threat. They were armed, they were clearly experts, and they outnumbered Julian's men significantly. The realization of his impossible position finally broke through Julian's consciousness. Not only had he lost any legal claim to Elara, but he was physically outmatched and in hostile territory. "This isn't over," Julian muttered, but even he could hear the defeat in his own voice. "Oh, it's over," Elara replied with absolute finality. "You have lost. You have lost any claim to me, any right to my father's inheritance, any power over my life. But more importantly, you have lost the chance to redeem yourself as a human being." She stepped closer to him, and for a fleeting moment, Julian thought he might have found some crack in the armor of this new woman. But when she spoke, her words were like a final judgment. "I forgive you," she said. And those words hit Julian harder than any insult could have. "Not because you deserve it, but because I will no longer allow your poison to live in my heart. I forgive you, and I release you to live with the consequences of your choices." She turned her back on him and walked toward Stone Hawk, taking her daughters by the hand. "Let's go home," she said in the Serpent River tongue, and the small family began the journey back to the land she had come to love more than any place on earth. The years that followed confirmed the totality of Elara's victory. Julian never attempted to contact her again and eventually vanished from the region, rumors saying he lost his fortune in bad investments and ended his days as a bitter drunk in some remote town. Elara's inheritance, after a protracted legal battle where witness testimony proved the fraudulent circumstances of her forced marriage, was eventually transferred to her in full. She used the money not to return to a civilized life, but to establish trade routes and resources that benefited the Serpent River people, creating prosperity and stability for the community that had taken her in. Her twin daughters grew up as true children of the desert, bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable navigating the complexities of Apache life and the realities of the rapidly expanding world that surrounded them. They became bridges between worlds, respected by whites and Apaches alike for their wisdom and diplomatic skill. Elara herself became a legendary figure, not just among the Serpent River people, but in the entire border region. Her story was told in whispers around campfires, a woman who was cast aside as useless, but who found a way not only to survive, but to thrive beyond the wildest dreams of those who had underestimated her. On quiet desert nights, when the stars shone like promises kept over the land, Elara would often sit outside their lodge with Stonehawk and her daughters, telling the story of the journey that brought them all together. It was a story of betrayal and rebirth, of death and resurrection, of a woman who discovered that her true worth was not dependent on the opinions of others, but on the strength forged in her own heart. The woman who had once been abandoned to die in the desert for being flawed, was now celebrated as a mother, a healer, a leader, and a bridge between worlds. She had found not only love and family, but her true purpose. And in the faces of her daughters, she saw the reflection not of the failure she was once made to believe she was, but of the absolute triumph of a woman who had seized control of her own destiny and created something beautiful from the ashes of her destruction. Elara Sampaoli's journey shows us one of the most powerful lessons life can offer: never, ever let others define your worth. For years, Elara lived believing she was defective, incomplete, a broken woman unworthy of love or respect. Her society, her husband, and even her doctors had told her that her value was tied entirely to her ability to have children. When that ability was seemingly denied to her, everyone around her treated her like a disposable object. But the desert, that seemingly hostile place where she was abandoned to die, became the crucible where her true strength was forged. There, she learned that a person's value isn't measured by the expectations others have of them, but by their ability to reinvent themselves, to find purpose in the most adverse circumstances, and to build a new identity based on self-love, not external approval. Elara's transformation was not magical or instantaneous. It was the result of conscious decisions she made every single day. The decision to trust in a stranger's kindness. The decision to learn new skills. The decision to open her heart to an authentic love. And finally, the decision to stand up for herself when her past returned to claim her. Each of these choices led her further away from the victim she had been and closer to the empowered woman she became. Her story reminds us that the darkest moments of our lives are often the very catalysts for our most extraordinary transformations. The abandonment that Julian planned as her final destruction became the first step toward her liberation. The desert that was meant to be her tomb became her place of rebirth. The tears she shed over her supposed infertility were transformed into tears of joy as she held her twin daughters in her arms. But perhaps the most important lesson is that true love arrives when we learn to value ourselves. Stonehawk didn't fall in love with Elara because she was perfect by her old society's standards, but because he recognized in her a strength, an intelligence, and a courage that she herself was learning to appreciate. His love was the mirror that showed her her own true value, but only because she had already begun the internal work of recognizing her own dignity. Her story also teaches us about the transformative power of forgiveness, not as a concession to those who have hurt us, but as an act of personal liberation. When Elara forgave Julian, she didn't do it because he deserved it, but because she refused to allow his hatred to continue poisoning her own heart. Forgiveness was her final declaration of emotional independence. We all face moments in our lives when we feel we have been cast aside, undervalued, or declared insufficient by others. Elara's story is a powerful reminder that those moments do not define our destination. We have the power to write new chapters, to find new tribes that value us, to discover talents we never knew we had, and to create lives that are more authentic and fulfilling than we ever imagined possible. The desert awaits all of us in different forms: a painful divorce, a job loss, an illness, a betrayal. But as Elara learned, the desert is not the end of the story. It is the place where we discover who we truly are when everything superficial has been stripped away. It is where we learn that real strength comes not from external circumstances, but from the internal resolve to not just survive but thrive. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment and let us know which country you are watching from. Your feedback is so important to us. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to keep receiving incredible stories like this one. There's a new story appearing for you right now. Click on the story that's appearing on your screen and prepare to be amazed.